In this video, we bring you 3 of Agatha Christie's most gripping tales. First, a rich woman's carefully guarded life is about to explode when a mysterious case puts everything at risk. Then, prepare to be swept into a high-stakes adventure as a daring million-dollar bond robbery sets off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. And just when you think you've seen it all, step into the glamorous Grand Metropolitan Hotel, where a jewel robbery leads to a web of lies and betrayal. With danger lurking in every shadow, these stories will leave you on the edge of your seat, where every suspect could be guilty and nothing is what it seems.
Agatha Christie, The Case of the Rich Woman. The name of Mrs. Abner Reimer was brought to Mr. Parker Pyne. He knew the name, and he raised his eyebrows. Presently his client was shown into the room. Mrs. Reimer was a tall woman, big-boned. Her figure was ungainly, and the velvet dress and the heavy fur coat she wore did not disguise the fact. The knuckles of her large hands were pronounced. Her face was big and broad and highly coloured. Her black hair was fashionably dressed, and there were many tips of curled ostrich in her hat. She plumped herself down on a chair with a nod. "Good morning," she said. Her voice had a rough accent. "If you're any good at all, you'll tell me how to spend my money." "Most original," murmured Mr. Parker Pyne. "Few ask that in these days. So you really find it difficult, Mrs. Reimer?" "Yes, I do," said the lady bluntly. "I've got 3 fur coats, a lot of Paris dresses and such like. I've got a car and a house in Park Lane. I've had a yacht, but I don't like the sea. I've got a lot of those high-class servants that look down their nose at you. I've travelled a bit and seen foreign parts, and I'm blessed if I can think of anything more to buy or do." She looked hopefully at Mr. Pyne. "There are hospitals," he said. "What? Give it away, you mean? No, that I won't do. That money was worked for, let me tell you, worked for hard. If you think I'm going to hand it out like so much dirt, well, you're mistaken. I want to spend it. Spend it and get some good out of it. Now, if you've got any ideas that are worthwhile in that line, you can depend on a good fee." "Your proposition interests me," said Mr. Pyne. "You do not mention a country house." "I forgot it, but I've got one. Bores me to death." "You must tell me more about yourself. Your problem is not easy to solve." "I'll tell you and willing. I'm not ashamed of what I've come from. Worked in a farmhouse I did, when I was a girl. Hard work it was too. Then I took up with Abner. He was a workman in the mills nearby. He courted me for 8 years, and then we got married." "And you were happy?" asked Mr. Pyne. "I was. He was a good man to me, Abner. We had a hard struggle of it, though. He was out of a job twice and children coming along. 4 we had, 3 boys and a girl, and none of them lived to grow up. I dare say it would have been different if they had." Her face softened, looked suddenly younger. "His chest was weak. Abner's was. They wouldn't take him for the war. He did well at home. He was made foreman. He was a clever fellow, Abner. He worked out a process. They treated him fair, I will say, gave him a good sum for it. He used that money for another idea of his. That brought in money hand over fist. He was a master now, employing his own workmen. He bought 2 concerns that were bankrupt and made them pay. The rest was easy. Money came in hand over fist. It's still coming in. Mind you, it was rare fun at first, having a house and a tip-top bathroom and servants of one's own. No more cooking and scrubbing and washing to do. Just sit back on your silk cushions in the drawing-room and ring the bell for tea, like any countess might. Grand fun it was, and we enjoyed it. And then we came up to London. I went to swell dressmakers for my clothes. We went to Paris and the Riviera. Rare fun it was." "And then?" said Mr. Parker Pyne. "We got used to it, I suppose," said Mrs. Reimer. "After a bit it didn't seem so much fun. Why, there were days when we didn't even fancy our meals properly, us, with any dish we fancied to choose from. As for baths, well, in the end, 1 bath a day's enough for anyone. And Abner's health began to worry him. Paid good money to doctors, we did, but they couldn't do anything. They tried this and they tried that, but it was no use. He died. She paused. He was a young man, only 43. Mr. Pine nodded sympathetically. That was 5 years ago. Money's still rolling in. It seems wasteful not to be able to do anything with it. But as I tell you, I can't think of anything else to buy that I haven't got already. In other words, said Mr. Pine, your life is dull. You are not enjoying it. I'm sick of it, said Mrs. Rymer gloomily. I've no friends. The new lot only want subscriptions, and they laugh at me behind my back. The old lot won't have anything to do with me. My rolling up in a car makes them shy. Can you do anything or suggest anything? It is possible that I can, said Mr. Pine slowly. It will be difficult, but I believe there is a chance of success. I think it's possible I can give you back what you have lost, your interest in life. How? Demanded Mrs. Rymer curtly. That, said Mr. Parker Pine, is my professional secret. I never disclose my methods beforehand. The question is, will you take a chance? I do not guarantee success, but I do think there is a reasonable possibility of it. And how much will it cost? I shall have to adopt unusual methods, and therefore it will be expensive. My charges will be £1,000, payable in advance. You can open your mouth all right, can't you? Said Mrs. Rymer appreciatively. Well, I'll risk it. I'm used to paying top price. Only when I pay for a thing, I take good care that I get it. You shall get it, said Mr. Parker Pine. Never fear. I'll send you the cheque this evening, said Mrs. Rymer, rising. I'm sure I don't know why I should trust you. Fools and their money are soon parted, they say. I dare say I'm a fool. You've got nerve to advertise in all the papers that you can make people happy. Those advertisements cost me money, said Mr. Pine. If I could not make my words good, that money would be wasted. I know what causes unhappiness, and consequently I have a clear idea of how to produce an opposite condition. Mrs. Rymer shook her head doubtfully and departed, leaving a cloud of expensive mixed essences behind her. The handsome Claude Luttrell strolled into the office. Something in my line? Mr. Pine shook his head. Nothing so simple, he said. No, this is a difficult case. We must, I fear, take a few risks. We must attempt the unusual. Mrs. Oliver? Mr. Pine smiled at the mention of the world-famous novelist. Mrs. Oliver, he said, is really the most conventional of all of us. I have in mind a bold and audacious coup. By the way, you might ring up Dr. Antrobus. Antrobus? Yes, his services will be needed. A week later, Mrs. Rymer once more entered Mr. Parker Pine's office. He rose to receive her. This delay, I assure you, has been necessary, he said. Many things had to be arranged, and I had to secure the services of an unusual man who had to come half across Europe. Oh! She said it suspiciously. It was constantly present in her mind that she had paid out a cheque for £1,000, and the cheque had been cashed. Mr. Parker Pine touched a buzzer. A young girl, dark, oriental-looking, but dressed in white nurse's kit, answered it. Is everything ready, Nurse de Sarah? Yes. Dr. Constantine is waiting. What are you going to do? Asked Mrs. Rymer, with a touch of uneasiness. Introduce you to some Eastern magic, dear lady, said Mr. Parker Pine. Mrs. Rymer followed the nurse up to the next floor. Here she was, ushered into a room that bore no relation to the rest of the house. Oriental embroideries covered the walls. There were divans with soft cushions and beautiful rugs on the floor. A man was bending over a coffee pot. He straightened as they entered. Dr. Constantine, said the nurse. The doctor was dressed in European clothes, but his face was swarthy, and his eyes were dark and oblique with a peculiarly piercing power in their glance. So this is my patient? He said in a low, vibrant voice. I'm not a patient, said Mrs. Rymer. Your body is not sick, said the doctor, but your soul is weary. We of the East know how to cure that disease. Sit down and drink a cup of coffee. Mrs. Rymer sat down and accepted a tiny cup of the fragrant brew. As she sipped it, the doctor talked. Here in the West, they treat only the body. A mistake. The body is only the instrument. A tune is played upon it. It may be a sad, weary tune. It may be a gay tune full of delight. That last is what we shall give you. You have money. You shall spend it and enjoy. Life shall be worth living again. It is easy. Easy. So easy. A feeling of languor crept over Mrs. Rymer. The figures of the doctor and the nurse grew hazy. She felt blissfully happy and very sleepy. The doctor's figure grew bigger. The whole world was growing bigger. The doctor was looking into her eyes. "Sleep," he was saying. "Sleep. Your eyelids are closing. Soon you will sleep. You will sleep. You will sleep." Mrs. Rymer's eyelids closed. She floated with a wonderful great big world. When her eyes opened, it seemed to her that a long time had passed. She remembered several things vaguely. Strange, impossible dreams. Then a feeling of waking. Then further dreams. She remembered something about a car, and the dark, beautiful girl in nurse's uniform bending over her. Anyway, she was properly awake now, and in her own bed. At least, was it her own bed? It felt different. It lacked the delicious softness of her own bed. It was vaguely reminiscent of days almost forgotten. She moved, and it creaked. Mrs. Rymer's bed in Park Lane never creaked. She looked round. Decidedly, this was not Park Lane. Was it a hospital? No, she decided, not a hospital. Nor was it a hotel. It was a bare room, the walls an uncertain shade of lilac. There was a deal washstand with a jug and basin upon it. There was a deal chest of drawers and a tin trunk. There were unfamiliar clothes hanging on pegs. There was the bed covered with a much-mended quilt, and there was herself in it. "Where am I?" said Mrs. Rymer. The door opened, and a plump little woman bustled in. She had red cheeks and a good-humoured air. Her sleeves were rolled up, and she wore an apron. "There!" she exclaimed. "She's awake. Come in, doctor." Mrs. Rymer opened her mouth to say several things, but they remained unsaid, for the man who followed the plump woman into the room was not in the least like the elegant, swarthy Dr. Constantine. He was a bent old man who peered through thick glasses. "That's better," he said, advancing to the bed and taking up Mrs. Rymer's wrist. "You'll soon be better now, my dear." "What's been the matter with me?" demanded Mrs. Rymer. "You had a kind of seizure," said the doctor. "You've been unconscious for a day or two. Nothing to worry about." "Gave us a fright, you did, Hannah," said the plump woman. "You've been raving too, saying the oddest things." "Yes, yes, Mrs. Gardner," said the doctor repressively. "But we mustn't excite the patient. You'll soon be up and about again, my dear." "But don't you worry about the work, Hannah," said Mrs. Gardner. "Mrs. Roberts has been in to give me a hand, and we've got on fine. Just lie still and get well, my dear." "Why do you call me Hannah?" said Mrs. Rymer. "Well, it's your name," said Mrs. Gardner, bewildered. "No, it isn't. My name is Amelia. Amelia Rymer. Mrs. Abner Rymer." The doctor and Mrs. Gardner exchanged glances. "Well, just you lie still," said Mrs. Gardner. "Yes, yes, no worry," said the doctor. They withdrew. Mrs. Rymer lay puzzling. Why did they call her Hannah, and why had they exchanged that glance of amused incredulity when she had given them her name? Where was she, and what had happened? She slipped out of bed. She felt a little uncertain on her legs, but she walked slowly to the small dormer window and looked out. On a farmyard. Completely mystified, she went back to bed. What was she doing in a farmhouse that she had never seen before? Mrs. Gardner re-entered the room with a bowl of soup on a tray. Mrs. Rymer began her questions. "What am I doing in this house?" she demanded. "Who brought me here?" "Nobody brought you, my dear. It's your home. Leastways, you've lived here for the last 5 years, and me not suspecting once that you were liable to fits." "Lived here? 5 years?" "That's right. Why, Hannah, you don't mean that you still don't remember?" "I've never lived here. I've never seen you before. You see, you've had this illness, and you've forgotten." "I've never lived here." "But you have, my dear." Suddenly Mrs. Gardner darted across to the chest of drawers and brought to Mrs. Rymer a faded photograph in a frame. It represented a group of 4 persons, a bearded man, a plump woman, Mrs. Gardner, a tall, lank maid with a pleasantly sheepish grin, and somebody in a prim dress and apron. Herself. Stupefied, Mrs. Rymer gazed at the photograph. Mrs. Gardner put the soup down beside her and quietly left the room. Mrs. Rymer sipped the soup mechanically. It was good soup, strong and hot. All the time her brain was in a whirl. Who was mad, Mrs. Gardner or herself? One of them must be. But there was the doctor, too. "I'm Amelia Rymer," she said firmly to herself. "I know I'm Amelia Rymer, and nobody's going to tell me different." She had finished the soup. She put the bowl back, or the tray. A folded newspaper caught her eye, and she picked it up and looked at the date on it. October 19th. What day had she gone to Mr. Parker Pine's office? Either the 15th or the 16th. Then she must have been ill for 3 days. "That rascally doctor," said Mrs. Rymer wrathfully. All the same, she was a shade relieved. She had heard of cases where people had forgotten who they were for years at a time. She had been afraid some such thing had happened to her. She began turning the pages of the paper, scanning the columns idly, when suddenly a paragraph caught her eye. Mrs. Abner Rymer, widow of Abner Rymer, the Buttonshank King, was removed yesterday to a private home for mental cases. For the past 2 days she has persisted in declaring she was not herself, but a servant girl named Hannah Morehouse. "Hannah Morehouse! So that's it," said Mrs. Rymer. "She's me and I'm her. Kind of double, I suppose. Well, we can soon put that right, if that oily hypocrite of a Parker Pine is up to some game or other." But at this minute her eye was caught by the name Constantine staring at her from the printed page. This time it was a headline. Dr. Constantine's Claim. At a farewell lecture given last night on the eve of his departure for Japan, Dr. Claudius Constantine advanced some startling theories. He declared that it was possible to prove the existence of the soul by transferring a soul from one body to another. In the course of his experiments in the East, he had, he claimed, successfully effected a double transfer, the soul of a hypnotized body, A being transferred to a hypnotized body B, and the soul of B to the body of A. On recovering from the hypnotic sleep, A declared herself to be B, and B thought herself to be A. For the experiment to succeed, it was necessary to find 2 people with a great bodily resemblance. It was an undoubted fact that 2 people resembling each other were en rapport. This was very noticeable in the case of twins, but 2 strangers, varying widely in social position, but with a marked similarity of feature, were found to exhibit the same harmony of structure. Mrs. Rymer cast the paper from her. The scoundrel! The black scoundrel! She saw the whole thing now. It was a dastardly plot to get hold of her money. This Hannah Morehouse was Mr. Pine's tool, possibly an innocent one. He and that devil Constantine had brought off this fantastic coup. But she'd expose him. She'd show him up. She'd have the law on him. She'd tell everyone. Abruptly, Mrs. Rymer came to a stop in the tide of her indignation. She remembered that first paragraph. Hannah Morehouse had not been a docile tool. She had protested, had declared her individuality. And what had happened? "Clapped into a lunatic asylum, poor girl," said Mrs. Rymer. A chill ran down her spine. A lunatic asylum. They got you in there and they never let you get out. The more you said you were sane, the less they'd believe you. There you were and there you stayed. No, Mrs. Rymer wasn't going to run the risk of that. The door opened, and Mrs. Gardner came in. "Ah, you've drunk your soup, my dear. That's good. You'll soon be better now." "When was I taken ill?" demanded Mrs. Rymer. "Let me see. It was 3 days ago, on Wednesday. That was the 15th. You were took bad about 4 o'clock. "Ah." The ejaculation was fraught with meaning. It had been just about 4 o'clock when Mrs. Rymer had entered the presence of Dr. Constantine. "You slipped down in your chair," said Mrs. Gardner. "Oh," you says. "Oh," just like that. And then, "I'm falling asleep," you says in a dreamy voice. "I'm falling asleep." And fall asleep you did, and we put you to bed and sent for the doctor, and here you've been ever since." "I suppose," Mrs. Rymer ventured, "there isn't any way you could know who I am. Apart from my face, I mean." "Well, that's a queer thing to say," said Mrs. Gardner. "What is there to go by better than a person's face, I'd like to know? There's your birthmark, though, if that satisfies you better." "A birthmark?" said Mrs. Rymer, brightening. She had no such thing. "Strawberry mark just under the right elbow," said Mrs. Gardner. "Look for yourself, my dear." "This will prove it," said Mrs. Rymer to herself. She knew that she had no strawberry mark under the right elbow. She turned back the sleeve of her nightdress. The strawberry mark was there. Mrs. Rymer burst into tears. 4 days later, Mrs. Rymer rose from her bed. She had thought out several plans of action and rejected them. She might show the paragraph in the paper to Mrs. Gardner and the doctor and explain. Would they believe her? Mrs. Rymer was sure they would not. She might go to the police. Would they believe her? Again, she thought not. She might go to Mr. Pine's office. That idea undoubtedly pleased her best. For one thing, she would like to tell that oily scoundrel what she thought of him. She was debarred from putting this plan into operation by a vital obstacle. She was at present in Cornwall, as she had learned, and she had no money for the journey to London. 2 and 4 pence in a worn purse seemed to represent her financial position. And so, after 4 days, Mrs. Rymer made a sporting decision. For the present, she would accept things. She was Hannah Morehouse. Very well, she would be Hannah Morehouse. For the present, she would accept the role, and later, when she had saved sufficient money, she would go to London and beard the swindler in his den. And having thus decided, Mrs. Rymer accepted her role with perfect good temper, even with a kind of sardonic amusement. History was repeating itself indeed. This life here reminded her of her girlhood. How long ago that seemed. The work was a bit hard after her years of soft living, but after the first week she found herself slipping into the ways of the farm. Mrs. Gardner was a good-tempered, kindly woman. Her husband, a big, taciturn man, was kindly also. The lank, shambling man of the photograph had gone, and another farmhand came in his stead, a good-humoured giant of 45, slow of speech and thought, but with a shy twinkle in his blue eyes. The weeks went by. At last the day came when Rymer had enough money to pay her fare to London. But she did not go. She put it off. Time enough, she thought. She wasn't easy in her mind about asylums yet. That scoundrel, Parker Pine, was clever. He'd get a doctor to say she was mad, and she'd be clapped out of sight with no one knowing anything about it. Besides, said Mrs. Rymer to herself, a bit of a change does one good. She rose early and worked hard. Joe Welsh, the new farmhand, was ill that winter, and she and Mrs. Gardner nursed him. The big man was pathetically dependent on them. Spring came, lambing time. There were wildflowers in the hedges, a treacherous softness in the air. Joe Welsh gave Hannah a hand with her work. Hannah did Joe's mending. Sometimes on Sundays, they went for a walk together. Joe was a widower. His wife had died 4 years before. Since her death he frankly confessed it, taken a drop too much. He didn't go much to the Crown nowadays. He bought himself some new clothes. Mr. and Mrs. Gardner laughed. Hannah made fun of Joe. She teased him about his clumsiness. Joe didn't mind. He looked bashful but happy. After spring came summer, a good summer that year. Everyone worked hard. Harvest was over. The leaves were red and golden on the trees. It was October 8th when Hannah looked up one day from a cabbage she was cutting and saw Mr. Parker Pine leaning over the fence. "You!" said Hannah, alias Mrs. Rymer. "You!" It was some time before she got it all out, and when she had said her say, she was out of breath. Mr. Parker Pine smiled blandly. "I quite agree with you," he said. "A cheat and a liar, that's what you are," said Mrs. Rymer, repeating herself. "You with your Constantines and your hypnotizing and that poor girl Hannah Morehouse shut up with loonies." "No," said Mr. Parker Pine. "There you misjudge me. Hannah Morehouse is not in a lunatic asylum because Hannah Morehouse never existed." "Indeed," said Mrs. Rymer. And what about the photograph of her that I saw with my own eyes? Faked, said Mr. Pine. Quite a simple thing to manage. And the piece in the paper about her? The whole paper was faked so as to include items in a natural manner which would carry conviction, as it did. That rogue Dr. Constantine. An assumed name, assumed by a friend of mine with a talent for acting. Mrs. Rymer snorted. Oh! And I wasn't hypnotized either, I suppose. As a matter of fact, you were not. You drank your coffee a preparation of Indian hemp. After that, other drugs were administered and you were brought down here by car and allowed to recover consciousness. Then Mrs. Gardner has been in it all the time, said Mrs. Rymer. Mr. Parker Pine nodded. Bribed by you, I suppose, or filled up with a lot of lies. Mrs. Gardner trusts me, said Mr. Pine. I saved her only son from penal servitude. Something in his manner silenced Mrs. Rymer on the tack. What about the birthmark? She demanded. Mr. Pine smiled. It is already fading. In another 6 months it will have disappeared altogether. And what's the meaning of all this tomfoolery? Making a fool of me, sticking me down here as a servant, me with all that good money in the bank. But I suppose I needn't ask. You've been helping yourself to it, my fine fellow. That's the meaning of all this. It is true, said Mr. Parker Pine, that I did obtain from you, while you were under the influence of drugs, a power of attorney, and that during your, absence, I have assumed control of your financial affairs. But I can assure you, my dear madam, that apart from that original £1,000, no money of yours has found its way into my pocket. As a matter of fact, by judicious investments, your financial position is actually improved. He beamed at her. Then why? Began Mrs. Rymer. I am going to ask you a question, Mrs. Rymer, said Mr. Pine. You are an honest woman. You will answer me honestly, I know. I am going to ask you if you are happy. Happy? That's a pretty question. Steal a woman's money and ask her if she's happy. I like your impudence. You are still angry, he said. Most natural. But leave my misdeeds out of it for the moment. Mrs. Rymer, when you came to my office a year ago today, you were an unhappy woman. Will you tell me that you are unhappy now? If so, I apologize, and you are at liberty to take what steps you please against me. Moreover, I will refund you the £1,000 you paid me. Come, Mrs. Rymer, are you an unhappy woman now? Mrs. Rymer looked at Mr. Parker Pine, but she dropped her eyes when she spoke at last. No, she said, I'm not unhappy. A tone of wonder crept into her voice. You've got me there. I admit it. I've not been as happy as I am now since Abner died. I'm going to marry a man who works here, Joe Welsh. Our banns are going up next Sunday. That is, they were going up next Sunday. But now, of course, said Mr. Pine, everything is different. Mrs. Rymer's face flamed. She took a step forward. What do you mean, different? Do you think if I had all the money in the world it would make me a lady? I don't want to be a lady, thank you. A helpless, good-for-nothing lot they are. Joe's good enough for me, and I'm good enough for him. We suit each other, and we're going to be happy. As for you, Mr. Nosy Parker, you take yourself off and don't interfere with what doesn't concern you. Mr. Parker Pine took a paper from his pocket and handed it to her. The power of attorney, he said. Shall I tear it up? You will assume control of your own fortune now, I take it. A strange expression came over Mrs. Rymer's face. She thrust back the paper. Take it. I've said hard things to you, and some of them you deserved. You're a downy fellow, but all the same I trust you. £700 I'll have in the bank here. That'll buy us a farm we've got our eye on. The rest of it, well, let the hospitals have it. You cannot mean to hand over your entire fortune to hospitals. That's just what I do mean. Joe's a dear good fellow, but he's weak. Give him money and you'd ruin him. I've got him off the drink now, and I'll keep him off it. Thank God I know my own mind. I'm not going to let money come between me and happiness. You are a remarkable woman, said Mr. Pine slowly. Only 1 woman in 1,000 would act as you are doing. Then only 1 woman in 1,000's got sense, said Mrs. Rymer. I take off my hat to you, said Mr. Parker Pine, and there was an unusual note in his voice. He raised his hat with solemnity and moved away. "And Joe's never to know, mind," Mrs. Rymer called after him. She stood there with the dying sun behind her, a great blue-green cabbage in her hands, her head thrown back and her shoulders squared. A grand figure of a peasant woman, outlined against the setting sun. The $1 Million Bond Robbery was first published in 1924, during a time when international financial crimes were becoming a subject of public interest due to the post-World War I economic climate. The story reflects the era's fascination with large-scale thefts and the sophisticated means by which they were carried out. The plot of the story, involving the theft of Liberty bonds during a transatlantic voyage, also mirrors real-world concerns about the security of international financial transactions during the early 20th century. Agatha Christie cleverly uses this backdrop to craft a tale that combines the glamour of ocean liners with the intrigue of high-stakes financial crime, showcasing Poirot's ability to navigate both the physical and financial worlds with ease. Agatha Christie, The $1 Million Bond Robbery. "What a number of bond robberies there have been lately," I observed one morning, laying aside the newspaper. "Poirot, let us forsake the science of detection and take to crime instead. You are on the, how do you say it, get-rich-quick tack, eh, mon ami? Well, look at this last coup, the $1 million worth of Liberty bonds which the London and Scottish Bank were sending to New York, and which disappeared in such a remarkable manner on board the Olympia. If it were not for the mal de mer, and the difficulty of practicing the so excellent method of laverguier for a longer time than the few hours of crossing the Channel, I should delight to voyage myself on one of these big liners," murmured Poirot dreamily. "Yes, indeed," I said enthusiastically. "Some of them must be perfect palaces. The swimming baths, the lounges, the restaurant, the palm courts. Really, it must be hard to believe that one is on the sea." "Me, I always know when I'm on the sea," said Poirot sadly. "And all those bagatelles that you enumerate, they say nothing to me. But, my friend, consider for a moment the geniuses that travel as it were incognito. On board these floating palaces, as you so justly call them, one would meet the elite, the haute noblesse of the criminal world." I laughed. "So that's the way your enthusiasm runs? You would have liked to cross swords with the man who sneaked the Liberty bonds?" The landlady interrupted us. "A young lady as wants to see you, Mr. Poirot. Here's her card." The card bore the inscription, "Miss Esme Farquhar," and Poirot, after diving under the table to retrieve a stray crumb and putting it carefully in the waste-paper basket, nodded to the landlady to admit her. In another minute, one of the most charming girls I have ever seen was ushered into the room. She was perhaps about 25, with big brown eyes and a perfect figure. She was well dressed and perfectly composed in manner. "Sit down, I beg of you, mademoiselle. This is my friend Captain Hastings, who aids me in my little problems." "I am afraid it is a big problem I have brought you today, Monsieur Poirot," said the girl, giving me a pleasant bow as she seated herself. "I dare say you have read about it in the papers. I am referring to the theft of Liberty bonds on the Olympia." Some astonishment must have shown itself in Poirot's face, for she continued quickly. "You are doubtless asking yourself what I have to do with a grave institution like the London and Scottish Bank. In one sense nothing, in another sense everything. You see, Monsieur Poirot, I am engaged to Mr. Philip Ridgway." "Ha ha! And Mr. Philip Ridgway was in charge of the bonds when they were stolen. Of course, no actual blame can attach to him. It was not his fault in any way. Nevertheless, he is half distraught over the matter, and his uncle, I know, insists that he must carelessly have mentioned having them in his possession. It is a terrible setback in his career." "Who is his uncle?" "Mr. Vavasour, Joint General Manager of the London and Scottish Bank. Suppose, Miss Farquhar, that you recount to me the whole story." "Very well. As you know, the bank wished to extend their credits in America, and for this purpose decided to send over $1 million in Liberty bonds. Mr. Vavasour selected his nephew, who had occupied a position of trust in the bank for many years, and who was conversant with all the details of the bank's dealings in New York, to make the trip. The Olympia sailed from Liverpool on the 23rd, and the bonds were handed over to Philip on the morning of that day by Mr. Vavasor and Mr. Shaw, the two joint general managers of the London and Scottish Bank. They were counted, enclosed in a package and sealed in his presence, and he then locked the package at once in his portmanteau. "A portmanteau with an ordinary lock?" "No. Mr. Shaw insisted on a special lock being fitted to it by Hubbs's. Philip, as I say, placed the package at the bottom of the trunk. It was stolen just a few hours before reaching New York. A rigorous search of the whole ship was made, but without result. The bonds seemed literally to have vanished into thin air." Poirot made a grimace. "But they did not vanish absolutely, since I gather that they were sold in small parcels within half an hour of the docking of the Olympia. Well, undoubtedly the next thing is for me to see Mr. Ridgway. I was about to suggest that you should lunch with me at the Cheshire Cheese. Philip will be there. He is meeting me, but does not yet know that I have been consulting you on his behalf." We agreed to this suggestion readily enough and drove there in a taxi. Mr. Philip Ridgway was there before us, and looked somewhat surprised to see his fiancée arriving with two complete strangers. He was a nice-looking young fellow, tall and spruce, with a touch of greying hair at the temples, though he could not have been much over 30. Miss Farquhar went up to him and laid her hand on his arm. "You must forgive my acting without consulting you, Philip," she said. "Let me introduce you to Monsieur Hercule Poirot, of whom you must often have heard, and his friend, Captain Hastings." Ridgway looked very astonished. "Of course I have heard of you, Monsieur Poirot," he said, as he shook hands, "but I had no idea that Esme was thinking of consulting you about our trouble." "I was afraid you would not let me do it, Philip," said Miss Farquhar meekly. "So you took care to be on the safe side," he observed with a smile. "I hope Monsieur Poirot will be able to throw some light on this extraordinary puzzle, for I confess frankly that I am nearly out of my mind with worry and anxiety about it." Indeed, his face looked drawn and haggard, and showed only too clearly the strain under which he was labouring. "Well, well," said Poirot, "let us lunch, and over lunch we will put our heads together and see what can be done. I want to hear Mr. Ridgway's story from his own lips." Whilst we discussed the excellent steak and kidney pudding of the establishment, Philip Ridgway narrated the circumstances leading to the disappearance of the bonds. His story agreed with that of Miss Farquhar in every particular. When he had finished, Poirot took up the thread with a question. "What exactly led you to discover that the bonds had been stolen, Mr. Ridgway?" He laughed rather bitterly. "The thing stared me in the face, Monsieur Poirot. I couldn't have missed it. My cabin trunk was half out from under the bunk and all scratched and cut about where they'd tried to force the lock." "But I understood that it had been opened with a key." "That's so. They tried to force it but couldn't. And in the end, they must have got it unlocked somehow or other." "Curious," said Poirot, his eyes beginning to flicker with the green light I knew so well. "Very curious. They waste much time trying to prise it open, and then, sapristi, they find that they have the key all the time, for each of Hubbs's locks are unique." "That's just why they couldn't have had the key. It never left me day or night." "You are sure of that?" "I can swear to it. And besides, if they had had the key or a duplicate, why should they waste time trying to force an obviously unforceable lock?" "Ah, there is exactly the question we are asking ourselves. I venture to prophesy that the solution, if we ever find it, will hinge on that curious fact. I beg of you not to assault me if I ask you one more question. Are you perfectly certain you did not leave the trunk unlocked?" Philip Ridgway merely looked at him, and Poirot gesticulated apologetically. "Ah, but these things can happen, I assure you." "Very well. The bonds were stolen from the trunk. What did the thief do with them? How did he manage to get ashore with them?" "Ah," cried Ridgway. "That's just it. How? Word was passed to the customs authorities, and every soul that left the ship was gone over with a tooth comb." "And the bonds, I gather, made a bulky package?" "Certainly they did. They could hardly have been hidden on board, and anyway we know they weren't because they were offered for sale within half an hour of the Olympia's arrival, long before I got the cables going and the numbers sent out. One broker swears he bought some of them even before the Olympia got in, but you can't send bonds by wireless." "Not by wireless, but did any tug come alongside?" "Only the official ones, and that was after the alarm was given when everyone was on the lookout. I was watching out myself for their being passed over to someone that way. My God, Monsieur Poirot, this thing will drive me mad. People are beginning to say I stole them myself." "But you also were searched on landing, weren't you?" asked Poirot gently. "Yes." The young man stared at him in a puzzled manner. "You do not catch my meaning, I see," said Poirot, smiling enigmatically. "Now I should like to make a few inquiries at the bank." Ridgway produced a card and scribbled a few words on it. "Send this in, and my uncle will see you at once." Poirot thanked him, bade farewell to Miss Farquhar, and together we started out for Threadneedle Street and the head office of the London and Scottish Bank. On production of Ridgway's card, we were led through the labyrinth of counters and desks, skirting paying-in clerks and paying-out clerks, and up to a small office on the first floor where the joint general managers received us. They were two grave gentlemen who had grown grey in the service of the bank. Mr. Vavasour had a short white beard. Mr. Shaw was clean-shaven. "I understand you are strictly a private inquiry agent," said Mr. Vavasour. "Quite so, quite so. We have, of course, placed ourselves in the hands of Scotland Yard. Inspector McNeill has charge of the case. A very able officer, I believe." "I am sure of it," said Poirot politely. "You will permit a few questions on your nephew's behalf? About this lock? Who ordered it from Hubbs's?" "I ordered it myself," said Mr. Shaw. "I would not trust to any clerk in the matter. As to the keys, Mr. Ridgway had one, and the other two are held by my colleague and myself." "And no clerk has had access to them?" Mr. Shaw turned inquiringly to Mr. Vavasour. "I think I am correct in saying that they have remained in the safe where we placed them on the 23rd, said Mr. Vavasour. "My colleague was unfortunately taken ill a fortnight ago, in fact on the very day that Philip left us. He has only just recovered." "Severe bronchitis is no joke to a man of my age," said Mr. Shaw ruefully. "But I am afraid Mr. Vavasour has suffered from the hard work entailed by my absence, especially with this unexpected worry coming on top of everything." Poirot asked a few more questions. I judged that he was endeavouring to gauge the exact amount of intimacy between uncle and nephew. Mr. Vavasour's answers were brief and punctilious. His nephew was a trusted official of the bank, and had no debts or money difficulties that he knew of. He had been entrusted with similar missions in the past. Finally, we were politely bowed out. "I am disappointed," said Poirot, as we emerged into the street. "You hope to discover more. They are such stodgy old men." "It is not their stodginess which disappoints me, mon ami. I do not expect to find in a bank manager a keen financier with an eagle glance, as your favourite works of fiction put it. No, I am disappointed in the case. It is too easy." "Easy?" "Yes, do you not find it almost childishly simple?" "You know who stole the bonds?" "I do." "But then, we must— Why—" "Do not confuse and fluster yourself, Hastings. We are not going to do anything at present." "But why? What are you waiting for?" "For the Olympia. She is due on her return trip from New York on Tuesday." "But if you know who stole the bonds, why wait? He may escape." "To a South Sea island where there is no extradition? No, mon ami, he would find life very uncongenial there. As to why I wait, eh bien, to the intelligence of Hercule Poirot the case is perfectly clear, but for the benefit of others, not so greatly gifted by the good God, the Inspector McNeill, for instance, it would be as well to make a few inquiries to establish the facts. One must have consideration for those less gifted than oneself." "Good Lord, Poirot, do you know, I'd give a considerable sum of money to see you make a thorough ass of yourself, just for once. You're so confoundedly conceited." "Do not enrage yourself, Hastings. In verity, I observe that there are times when you almost detest me. Alas, I suffer the penalties of greatness." The little man puffed out his chest and sighed so comically that I was forced to laugh. Tuesday saw us speeding to Liverpool in a first-class carriage of the L&NWR. Poirot had obstinately refused to enlighten me as to his suspicions, or certainties. He contented himself with expressing surprise that I, too, was not equally au fait with the situation. I disdained to argue, and entrenched my curiosity behind a rampart of pretended indifference. Once arrived at the quay alongside which lay the big transatlantic liner, Poirot became brisk and alert. Our proceedings consisted in interviewing 4 successive stewards and inquiring after a friend of Poirot's who had crossed to New York on the 23rd. An elderly gentleman, wearing glasses, a great invalid, hardly moved out of his cabin. The description appeared to tally with one Mr. Ventnor who had occupied the cabin C-24, which was next to that of Philip Ridgway. Although unable to see how Poirot had deduced Mr. Ventnor's existence and personal appearance, I was keenly excited. "Tell me," I cried, "was this gentleman one of the first to land when you got to New York?" The steward shook his head. "No, indeed, sir. He was one of the last off the boat." I retired crestfallen, and observed Poirot grinning at me. He thanked the steward, a note changed hands, and we took our departure. "It's all very well," I remarked heatedly, "but that last answer must have damped your precious theory. Grin as you please." "As usual, you see nothing, Hastings. That last answer is, on the contrary, the coping stone of my theory." I flung up my hands in despair. "I give it up." When we were in the train, speeding towards London, Poirot wrote busily for a few minutes, sealing up the result in an envelope. "This is for the good Inspector McNeill. We will leave it at Scotland Yard in passing, and then to the Rendezvous restaurant, where I have asked Miss Esme Farquhar to do us the honour of dining with us." "What about Ridgway?" "What about him?" asked Poirot with a twinkle. "Why, you surely don't think— You can't— The habit of incoherence is growing upon you, Hastings. As a matter of fact, I did think. If Ridgway had been the thief, which was perfectly possible, the case would have been charming, a piece of neat methodical work. But not so charming for Miss Farquhar. Possibly you are right, therefore all is for the best. Now, Hastings, let us review the case. I can see that you are dying to do so. The sealed package is removed from the trunk and vanishes, as Miss Farquhar puts it, into thin air. We will dismiss the thin air theory, which is not practicable at the present stage of science, and consider what is likely to have become of it. Everyone asserts the incredibility of its being smuggled ashore. Yes, but we know. You may know, Hastings. I do not. I take the view that since it seemed incredible, it was incredible. 2 possibilities remain. It was hidden on board, also rather difficult, or it was thrown overboard. With a cork on it, do you mean? Without a cork? I stared. But if the bonds were thrown overboard, they couldn't have been sold in New York. I admire your logical mind, Hastings. The bonds were sold in New York, therefore they were not thrown overboard. You see where that leads us? Where we were when we started. Jamais de la vie. If the package was thrown overboard and the bonds were sold in New York, the package could not have contained the bonds. Is there any evidence that the package did contain the bonds? Remember, Mr. Ridgway never opened it from the time it was placed in his hands in London. Yes, but then— Poirot waved an impatient hand. Permit me to continue. The last moment that the bonds are seen as bonds is in the office of the London and Scottish Bank on the morning of the 23rd. They reappear in New York half an hour after the Olympia gets in, and according to one man, whom nobody listens to, actually before she gets in. Supposing, then, that they have never been on the Olympia at all, is there any other way they could get to New York? Yes. The Gigantic leaves Southampton on the same day as the Olympia, and she holds the record for the Atlantic. Mailed by the Gigantic, the bonds would be in New York the day before the Olympia arrived. All is clear, the case begins to explain itself. The sealed packet is only a dummy, and the moment of its substitution must be in the office in the bank. It would be an easy matter for any of the 3 men present to have prepared a duplicate package which could be substituted for the genuine one. Très bien. The bonds are mailed to a confederate in New York, with instructions to sell as soon as the Olympia is in, but someone must travel on the Olympia to engineer the supposed moment of the robbery. But why? Because if Ridgway merely opens the packet and finds it a dummy, suspicion flies at once to London. No, the man on board in the cabin next door does his work, pretends to force the lock in an obvious manner so as to draw immediate attention to the theft, really unlocks the trunk with a duplicate key, throws the package overboard, and waits until the last to leave the boat. Naturally, he wears glasses to conceal his eyes, and is an invalid since he does not want to run the risk of meeting Ridgway. He steps ashore in New York and returns by the first boat available. But who? Which was he? The man who had a duplicate key, the man who ordered the lock, the man who has not been severely ill with bronchitis at his home in the country. That stodgy old man, Mr. Shaw. There are criminals in high places sometimes, my friend. Ah, here we are. Mademoiselle, I have succeeded. You permit? And beaming, Poirot kissed the astonished girl lightly on either cheek. The Jewel Robbery at the Grand Metropolitan was first published in 1923, a time when Agatha Christie was becoming a household name in detective fiction. The story is notable for its setting in a luxury hotel, a frequent backdrop in Christie's work, where the opulence of the surroundings contrasts with the darker undertones of crime and deception. The plot also reflects the era's fascination with jewellery and wealth, particularly in the wake of the post-World War I economic boom, which saw an increase in affluent characters and settings in literature. Christie's ability to weave intricate plots in such environments contributed to her enduring popularity. Agatha Christie, The Jewel Robbery at the Grand Metropolitan. Poirot, I said, a change of air would do you good. You think so, mon ami? I am sure of it. Eh, said my friend, smiling. It is all arranged, then. You will come? Where do you propose to take me? Brighton. As a matter of fact, a friend of mine in the city put me on to a very good thing, and, well, I have money to burn, as the saying goes. I think a weekend at the Grand Metropolitan would do us all the good in the world. Thank you. I accept most gratefully. You have the good heart to think of an old man, and the good heart, it is in the end worth all the little grey cells. Yes, I who speak to you am in danger of forgetting that sometimes. I did not quite relish the implication. I fancy that Poirot is sometimes a little inclined to underestimate my mental capacities, but his pleasure was so evident that I put my slight annoyance aside. Then that's all right, I said hastily. Saturday evening saw us dining at the Grand Metropolitan in the midst of a gay throng. All the world and his wife seemed to be at Brighton. The dresses were marvellous, and the jewels, worn sometimes with more love of display than good taste, were something magnificent. Hein, it is a sight, this, murmured Poirot. This is the home of the profiteer, is it not so, Hastings? Supposed to be, I replied, but we'll hope they aren't all tarred with the profiteering brush. Poirot gazed round him placidly. The sight of so many jewels makes me wish I had turned my brains to crime instead of to its detection. What a magnificent opportunity for some thief of distinction. Regard, Hastings, that stout woman by the pillar. She is, as you would say, plastered with gems. I followed his eyes. Why, I exclaimed, it's Mrs. Opalson. You know her? Slightly. Her husband is a rich stockbroker who made a fortune in the recent oil boom. After dinner, we ran across the Opalson in the lounge, and I introduced Poirot to them. We chatted for a few minutes and ended by having our coffee together. Poirot said a few words in praise of some of the costlier gems displayed on the lady's ample bosom, and she brightened up at once. It's a perfect hobby of mine, Mr. Poirot. I just love jewellery. Ed knows my weakness, and every time things go well, he brings me something new. You are interested in precious stones? I have had a good deal to do with them one time and another, madame. My profession has brought me into contact with some of the most famous jewels in the world. He went on to narrate, with discreet pseudonyms, the story of the historic jewels of a reigning house, and Mrs. Opalson listened with bated breath. There now, she exclaimed as he ended. If it isn't just like a play. You know, I've got some pearls of my own that have a history attached to them. I believe it's supposed to be one of the finest necklaces in the world. The pearls are so beautifully matched and so perfect in colour. I declare I really must run up and get it." "Oh, madame," protested Poirot, "you are too amiable. Pray do not derange yourself." "Oh, but I'd like to show it to you." The buxom dame waddled across to the lift briskly enough. Her husband, who had been talking to me, looked at Poirot inquiringly. "Madame, your wife is so amiable as to insist on showing me her pearl necklace," explained the latter. "Oh, the pearls!" Opalson smiled in a satisfied fashion. "Well, they are worth seeing. Cost a pretty penny, too. Still, the money's there all right. I could get what I paid for them any day, perhaps more. May have to, too, if things go on as they are now. Money's confoundedly tight in the city. All this infernal EPD." He rambled on, launching into technicalities where I could not follow him. He was interrupted by a small page boy who approached and murmured something in his ear. What? I'll come at once. Not taken ill, is she? Excuse me, gentlemen." He left us abruptly. Poirot leaned back and lit one of his tiny Russian cigarettes. Then, carefully and meticulously, he arranged the empty coffee cups in a neat row and beamed happily on the result. The minutes passed. The Opalsons did not return. "Curious," I remarked at length. "I wonder when they will come back." Poirot watched the ascending spirals of smoke and then said thoughtfully, "They will not come back." "Why?" "Because, my friend, something has happened." "What sort of thing? How do you know?" I asked curiously. Poirot smiled. "A few moments ago the manager came hurriedly out of his office and ran upstairs. He was much agitated. The lift boy is deep in talk with one of the pages. The lift bell has rung 3 times, but he heeds it not. Thirdly, even the waiters are distrait, and to make a waiter distrait—" Poirot shook his head with an air of finality. "The affair must indeed be of the first magnitude. Ah, it is as I thought. Here come the police." 2 men had just entered the hotel, one in uniform, the other in plain clothes. They spoke to a page, and were immediately ushered upstairs. A few minutes later, the same boy descended and came up to where we were sitting. "Mr. Opalson's compliments, and would you step upstairs?" Poirot sprang nimbly to his feet. One would have said that he awaited the summons. I followed with no less alacrity. The Opalsons' apartments were situated on the first floor. After knocking on the door, the page boy retired, and we answered the summons. "Come in." A strange scene met our eyes. The room was Mrs. Opalson's bedroom, and in the centre of it, lying back in an armchair, was the lady herself, weeping violently. She presented an extraordinary spectacle, with the tears making great furrows in the powder with which her complexion was liberally coated. Mr. Opalson was striding up and down angrily. The 2 police officials stood in the middle of the room, one with a notebook in hand. An hotel chambermaid, looking frightened to death, stood by the fireplace, and on the other side of the room a Frenchwoman, obviously Mrs. Opalson's maid, was weeping and wringing her hands with an intensity of grief that rivaled that of her mistress. Into this pandemonium stepped Poirot, neat and smiling. Immediately, with an energy surprising in one of her bulk, Mrs. Opalson sprang from her chair towards him. "There now, Ed may say what he likes, but I believe in luck, I do. It was fated I should meet you the way I did this evening, and I've a feeling that if you can't get my pearls back for me, nobody can." "Calm yourself, I pray of you, madame." Poirot patted her hand soothingly. "Reassure yourself. All will be well. Hercule Poirot will aid you." Mr. Opalson turned to the police inspector. "There will be no objection to my, calling in this gentleman, I suppose?" "None at all, sir," replied the man civilly, but with complete indifference. "Perhaps now your lady's feeling better, she'll just let us have the facts." Mrs. Opalson looked helplessly at Poirot. He led her back to her chair. "Seat yourself, madame, and recount to us the whole history without agitating yourself." Thus abjured, Mrs. Opalson dried her eyes gingerly, and began. "I came upstairs after dinner to fetch my pearls for Mr. Poirot here to see. The chambermaid and Celestine were both in the room as usual." "Excuse me, madame, but what do you mean by 'as usual'?" Mr. Opalson explained. I make it a rule that no one is to come into this room unless Celestine, the maid, is there also. The chambermaid does the room in the morning while Celestine is present, and comes in after dinner to turn down the beds under the same conditions. Otherwise, she never enters the room. Well, as I was saying, continued Mrs. Opalson, I came up. I went to the drawer here. She indicated the bottom right-hand drawer of the knee-hole dressing table, took out my jewel case and unlocked it. It seemed quite as usual, but the pearls were not there. The inspector had been busy with his notebook. When had you last seen them? He asked. They were there when I went down to dinner. You are sure? Quite sure. I was uncertain whether to wear them or not, but in the end I decided on the emeralds and put them back in the jewel case. Who locked up the jewel case? I did. I wear the key on a chain round my neck. She held it up as she spoke. The inspector examined it and shrugged his shoulders. The thief must have had a duplicate key. No difficult matter. The lock is quite a simple one. What did you do after you'd locked the jewel case? I put it back in the bottom drawer where I always keep it. You didn't lock the drawer? No, I never do. My maid remains in the room till I come up, so there's no need. The inspector's face grew graver. Am I to understand that the jewels were there when you went down to dinner, and that since then the maid has not left the room? Suddenly, as though the horror of her own situation for the first time burst upon her, Celestine uttered a piercing shriek, and flinging herself upon Poirot, poured out a torrent of incoherent French. The suggestion was infamous, that she should be suspected of robbing Madame. The police were well known to be of a stupidity incredible. But Monsieur, who was a Frenchman— A Belgian, interjected Poirot, but Celestine paid no attention to the correction. Monsieur would not stand by and see her falsely accused, while that infamous chambermaid was allowed to go scot-free. She had never liked her, a bold, red-faced thing, a born thief. She had said from the first that she was not honest, and had kept a sharp watch over her too when she was doing Madame's room. Let those idiots of policemen search her, and if they did not find Madame's pearls on her, it would be very surprising. Although this harangue was uttered in rapid and virulent French, Celestine had interlarded it with a wealth of gesture, and the chambermaid realized at least a part of her meaning. She reddened angrily. "If that foreign woman's saying I took the pearls, it's a lie," she declared heatedly. "I never so much as saw them." "Search her!" screamed the other. "You will find it is as I say." "You're a liar, do you hear?" said the chambermaid, advancing upon her. "Stole 'em yourself and want to put it on me. Why, I was only in the room about 3 minutes before the lady come up, and then you were sitting here the whole time, as you always do, like a cat watching a mouse." The inspector looked across inquiringly at Celestine. "Is that true? Didn't you leave the room at all?" "I did not actually leave her alone," admitted Celestine reluctantly. "But I went into my own room through the door here twice, once to fetch a reel of cotton, and once for my scissors. She must have done it then." "You wasn't gone a minute," retorted the chambermaid angrily. "Just popped out and in again. I'd be glad if the police would search me. I've nothing to be afraid of." At this moment there was a tap at the door. The inspector went to it. His face brightened when he saw who it was. "Ah," he said, "that's rather fortunate. I sent for one of our female searchers and she's just arrived. Perhaps if you wouldn't mind going into the room next door." He looked at the chambermaid, who stepped across the threshold with a toss of her head, the searcher following her closely. The French girl had sunk sobbing into a chair. Poirot was looking round the room, the main features of which I have made clear by a sketch. "Where does that door lead?" he inquired, nodding his head towards the one by the window. "Into the next apartment, I believe," said the inspector. "It's bolted anyway, on this side." Poirot walked across to it, tried it, then drew back the bolt and tried it again. "And on the other side as well," he remarked. "Well, that seems to rule out that." He walked over to the windows, examining each of them in turn. "And again, nothing. Not even a balcony outside." "Even if there were," said the inspector impatiently, "I don't see how that would help us if the maid never left the room." "Évidemment," said Poirot, not disconcerted, "as mademoiselle is positive she did not leave the room." He was interrupted by the reappearance of the chambermaid and the police searcher. "Nothing," said the latter laconically. "I should hope not indeed," said the chambermaid virtuously. "And that French hussy ought to be ashamed of herself taking away an honest girl's character." There, my girl, that's all right," said the inspector, opening the door. "Nobody suspects you. You go along and get on with your work." The chambermaid went unwillingly. "Going to search her?" she demanded, pointing at Celestine. "Yes, yes." He shut the door on her and turned the key. Celestine accompanied the searcher into the small room in her turn. A few minutes later she also returned. Nothing had been found on her. The inspector's face grew graver. "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to come along with me all the same, miss." He turned to Mrs. Opalson. "I'm sorry, madam, but all the evidence points that way. If she's not got them on her, they're hidden somewhere about the room." Celestine uttered a piercing shriek and clung to Poirot's arm. The latter bent and whispered something in the girl's ear. She looked up at him doubtfully. Si, mon enfant, I assure you it is better not to resist." Then he turned to the inspector. "You permit, monsieur? A little experiment, purely for my own satisfaction." "Depends on what it is," replied the police officer non-committally. Poirot addressed Celestine once more. "You have told us that you went into your room to fetch a reel of cotton. Whereabouts was it?" "On the top of the chest of drawers, monsieur." "And the scissors?" "They also." "Would it be troubling you too much, mademoiselle, to ask you to repeat those two actions? You were sitting here with your work, you say." Celestine sat down, and then, at a sign from Poirot, rose, passed into the adjoining room, took up an object from the chest of drawers, and returned. Poirot divided his attention between her movements and a large turnip of a watch which he held in the palm of his hand. "Again, if you please, mademoiselle." At the conclusion of the second performance, he made a note in his pocket-book and returned the watch to his pocket. "Thank you, mademoiselle. And you, monsieur," he bowed to the inspector, "for your courtesy." The inspector seemed somewhat entertained by this excessive politeness. Celestine departed in a flood of tears, accompanied by the woman and the plainclothes official. Then, with a brief apology to Mrs. Opalson, the inspector set to work to ransack the room. He pulled out drawers, opened cupboards, completely unmade the bed, and tapped the floor. Mr. Opalson looked on sceptically. "You really think you will find them?" "Yes, sir. It stands to reason. She hadn't time to take them out of the room. The lady's discovering the robbery so soon upset her plans. No, they're here right enough. One of the two must have hidden them, and it's very unlikely for the chambermaid to have done so." "More than unlikely, impossible," said Poirot quietly. "Eh?" The inspector stared. Poirot smiled modestly. "I will demonstrate. Hastings, my good friend, take my watch in your hand. With care. It is a family heirloom. Just now I timed mademoiselle's movements. Her first absence from the room was of 12 seconds, her second of 15. Now observe my actions. Madame will have the kindness to give me the key of the jewel case. I thank you. My friend Hastings will have the kindness to say, 'Go.'" "Go," I said. With almost incredible swiftness, Poirot wrenched open the drawer of the dressing-table, extracted the jewel case, fitted the key in the lock, opened the case, selected a piece of jewellery, shut and locked the case, and returned it to the drawer, which he pushed to again. His movements were like lightning. "Well, mon ami?" he demanded of me breathlessly. 46 seconds, I replied. "You see?" He looked round. "There would not have been time for the chambermaid even to take the necklace out, far less hide it." "Then that settles it on the maid," said the inspector with satisfaction, and returned to his search. He passed into the maid's bedroom next door. Poirot was frowning thoughtfully. Suddenly he shot a question at Mr. Opalson. "This necklace, it was without doubt insured?" Mr. Opalson looked a trifle surprised at the question. "Yes," he said hesitatingly, "that is so." "But what does that matter?" broke in Mrs. Opalson tearfully. "It's my necklace I want. It was unique. No money could be the same." "I comprehend, madame," said Poirot soothingly. "I comprehend perfectly. To la femme sentiment is everything. Is it not so? But monsieur, who has not the so fine susceptibility, will doubtless find some slight consolation in the fact." Of course," said Mr. Opalson rather uncertainly. "Still—" He was interrupted by a shout of triumph from the inspector. He came in dangling something from his fingers. With a cry, Mrs. Opalson heaved herself up from her chair. She was a changed woman. "Oh, my necklace!" She clasped it to her breast with both hands. We crowded round. "Where was it?" demanded Opalson. "Maid's bed, in among the springs of the wire mattress. She must have stolen it and hidden it there before the chambermaid arrived on the scene." "You permit, madame?" said Poirot gently. He took the necklace from her and examined it closely, then handed it back with a bow. "I'm afraid, madam, you'll have to hand it over to use for the time being," said the inspector. "We shall want it for the charge, but it shall be returned to you as soon as possible." Mr. Opalson frowned. "Is that necessary?" "I'm afraid so, sir. Just a formality." "Oh, let him take it, Ed," cried his wife. "I'd feel safer if he did. I shouldn't sleep a wink thinking someone else might try and get hold of it. That wretched girl. And I would never have believed it of her." There, my dear. Don't take on so." I felt a gentle pressure on my arm. It was Poirot. "Shall we slip away, my friend? I think our services are no longer needed." Once outside, however, he hesitated, and then, much to my surprise, he remarked, "I should rather like to see the room next door." The door was not locked, and we entered. The room, which was a large double one, was unoccupied. Dust lay about rather noticeably, and my sensitive friend gave a characteristic grimace as he ran his finger round a rectangular mark on a table near the window. "The service leaves to be desired," he observed dryly. He was staring thoughtfully out of the window and seemed to have fallen into a brown study. "Well?" I demanded impatiently. "What did we come in here for?" He started. "Je vous demande pardon, mon ami. I wished to see if the door was really bolted on this side also." "Well," I said, glancing at the door which communicated with the room we had just left, "it is bolted." Poirot nodded. He still seemed to be thinking. "And anyway," I continued, "what does it matter? The case is over. I wish you'd had more chance of distinguishing yourself, but it was the kind of case that even a stiff-backed idiot like that inspector couldn't go wrong over." Poirot shook his head. "The case is not over, my friend. It will not be over until we find out who stole the pearls." "But the maid did." "Why do you say that?" "Why?" I stammered. "They were found, actually in her mattress." Ta, said Poirot impatiently. "Those were not the pearls." "What?" "Imitation, mon ami." The statement took my breath away. Poirot was smiling placidly. The good inspector obviously knows nothing of jewels, but presently there will be a fine hullabaloo. "Come," I cried, dragging at his arm. "Where?" "We must tell the Opalsons at once." "I think not. But that poor woman— Eh bien, that poor woman, as you call her, will have a much better night believing the jewels to be safe." "But the thief may escape with them." "As usual, my friend, you speak without reflection. How do you know that the pearls Mrs. Opalson locked up so carefully tonight were not the false ones, and that the real robbery did not take place at a much earlier date?" "Oh!" I said, bewildered. "Exactly," said Poirot, beaming. "We start again." He led the way out of the room, paused a moment as though considering, and then walked down to the end of the corridor, stopping outside the small den where the chambermaids and valets of the respective floors congregated. Our particular chambermaid appeared to be holding a small court there, and to be retailing her late experiences to an appreciative audience. She stopped in the middle of a sentence. Poirot bowed with his usual politeness. "Excuse that I derange you, but I shall be obliged if you will unlock for me the door of Mr. Opalson's room." The woman rose willingly, and we accompanied her down the passage again. Mr. Opalson's room was on the other side of the corridor, its door facing that of his wife's room. The chambermaid unlocked it with her passkey, and we entered. As she was about to depart, Poirot detained her. "One moment. Have you ever seen among the effects of Mr. Opalson a card like this?" He held out a plain white card, rather highly glazed and uncommon in appearance. The maid took it and scrutinized it carefully. "No, sir, I can't say I have. But anyway, the valet has most to do with the gentlemen's rooms." "I see, thank you." Poirot took back the card. The woman departed. Poirot appeared to reflect a little. Then he gave a short, sharp nod of the head. "Ring the bell, I pray of you, Hastings, 3 times, for the valet." I obeyed, devoured with curiosity. Meanwhile, Poirot had emptied the waste paper basket on the floor and was swiftly going through its contents. In a few moments the valet answered the bell. To him, Poirot put the same question and handed him the card to examine. But the response was the same. The valet had never seen a card of that particular quality among Mr. Opalson's belongings. Poirot thanked him, and he withdrew, somewhat unwillingly, with an inquisitive glance at the overturned waste-paper basket and the litter on the floor. He could hardly have helped overhearing Poirot's thoughtful remark as he bundled the torn papers back again. "And the necklace was heavily insured." "Poirot," I cried, "I see—" "You see nothing, my friend," he replied quickly. "As usual, nothing at all. It is incredible, but there it is. Let us return to our own apartments." We did so in silence. Once there, to my intense surprise, Poirot effected a rapid change of clothing. "I go to London tonight," he explained. "It is imperative." "What?" "Absolutely. The real work, that of the brain, those brave little grey cells, it is done. I go to seek the confirmation. I shall find it. Impossible to deceive Hercule Poirot." "You'll come a cropper one of these days," I observed, rather disgusted by his vanity. "Do not be enraged. I beg of you, mon ami. I count on you to do me a service. Of your friendship." "Of course," I said eagerly, rather ashamed of my moroseness. "What is it?" "The sleeve of my coat that I have taken off. Will you brush it? See you. A little white powder has clung to it. You without doubt observed me run my finger round the drawer of the dressing-table?" "No, I didn't." "You should observe my actions, my friend. Thus I obtained the powder on my finger, and, being a little overexcited, I rubbed it on my sleeve. An action without method which I deplore, false to all my principles." "But what was the powder?" I asked, not particularly interested in Poirot's principles. "Not the poison of the Borgias," replied Poirot, with a twinkle. "I see your imagination mounting. I should say it was French chalk." "French chalk?" "Yes. Cabinet-makers use it to make drawers run smoothly." I laughed. "You old sinner! I thought you were working up to something exciting." "Au revoir, my friend. I save myself. I fly." The door shut behind him. With a smile, half of derision, half of affection, I picked up the coat and stretched out my hand for the clothes-brush. The next morning, hearing nothing from Poirot, I went out for a stroll, met some old friends, and lunched with them at their hotel. In the afternoon we went for a spin. A punctured tire delayed us, and it was past 8 when I got back to the Grand Metropolitan. The first sight that met my eyes was Poirot, looking even more diminutive than usual, sandwiched between the Opalsons, beaming in a state of placid satisfaction. "Mon ami Hastings," he cried, and sprang to meet me. "Embrace me, my friend. All has marched to a marvel." Luckily, the embrace was merely figurative, not a thing one is always sure of with Poirot. "Do you mean—" I began. "Just wonderful, I call it," said Mrs. Opalson, smiling all over her fat face. "Didn't I tell you, Ed, that if he couldn't get back my pearls, nobody would?" "You did, my dear, you did. And you were right." I looked helplessly at Poirot, and he answered the glance. "My friend Hastings is, as you say in England, all at the seaside. Seat yourself, and I will recount to you all the affair that has so happily ended." "Ended?" "But yes. They are arrested." "Who are arrested?" "The chambermaid and the valet, parbleu! You did not suspect?" Not with my parting hint about the French chalk? You said cabinet makers used it. Certainly they do. To make drawers slide easily. Somebody wanted that drawer to slide in and out without any noise. Who could that be? Obviously only the chambermaid. The plan was so ingenious that it did not at once leap to the eye, not even to the eye of Hercule Poirot. Listen, this was how it was done. The valet was in the empty room next door, waiting. The French maid leaves the room. Quick as a flash, the chambermaid whips open the drawer, takes out the jewel case, and slipping back the bolt, passes it through the door. The valet opens it at his leisure with the duplicate key with which he has provided himself, extracts the necklace, and waits his time. Celestine leaves the room again, and psst, in a flash the case is passed back again and replaced in the drawer. Madame arrives, the theft is discovered. The chambermaid demands to be searched with a good deal of righteous indignation and leaves the room without a stain on her character. The imitation necklace with which they have provided themselves has been concealed in the French girl's bed that morning by the chambermaid. A masterstroke, sir. But what did you go to London for? You remember the card? Certainly, it puzzled me, and puzzles me still. I thought... I hesitated delicately, glancing at Mr. Opalson. Poirot laughed heartily. Une blague! For the benefit of the valet. The card was one with a specially prepared surface for fingerprints. I went straight to Scotland Yard, asked for our old friend Inspector Japp, and laid the facts before him. As I had suspected, the fingerprints proved to be those of two well-known jewel thieves who have been wanted for some time. Japp came down with me. The thieves were arrested, and the necklace was discovered in the valet's possession. A clever pair, but they failed in method. Have I not told you, Hastings, at least 36 times, that without method— At least 36,000 times, I interrupted. But where did their method break down? Mon ami, it is a good plan to take a place as chambermaid or valet, but you must not shirk your work. They left an empty room undusted, and therefore, when the man put down the jewel case on the little table near the communicating door, it left a square mark. I remember, I cried. Before I was undecided. Then I knew. There was a moment's silence. And I've got my pearls, said Mrs. Opalson as a sort of Greek chorus. Well, I said, I'd better have some dinner. Poirot accompanied me. This ought to mean kudos for you, I observed. Pas du tout, replied Poirot tranquilly. Japp and the local inspector will divide the credit between them, but— He tapped his pocket. I have a cheque here, from Mr. Opalson. And how say you, my friend? This weekend has not gone according to plan. Shall we return here next weekend? At my expense this time?